whereas foundational Black Americans are the descendants of the African people who survived American slavery. Whereas slavery was such a huge part of early New York that 1 in 5 people living in New York City was an enslaved African. Whereas Battery Park was a dock where slaves were sold. Wall Street slave sellers lined up little mini prisons on Chambers Street as well as underneath the stock exchange. Whereas the largest slave plantation in the 13 original colonies wasn't in the South, but in Brooklyn, New York. Whereas in New York City between 16 and 1800s, laws were passed to restrict the activities and movements of Black residents and enslaved Black Americans. Whereas New York State ended slavery in 1827, New York City continued to intertwine the business of slavery with politics and people like William Frederick Havemeyer, who launched his political career from his family's sugar business, Domino Sugar, with money made through slavery. Whereas in 1846, a proposed amendment to the New York State Constitution that would have granted Black Americans the same voting rights as whites was rejected by the local electorate. Whereas New York's first free Black community, Seneca Village, was torn down to make room for Central Park through eminent domain. Whereas the U.S. Constitution granted Congress the authority to tax slaves as property in Article 1, Section 9. Whereas slave property tax was also embraced by abolitionists at the American Anti-Slavery Society annual meeting in 1850 in New York. Whereas New York City is one of the few cities that has personal income tax and offers few credits. Whereas in 2019, Warren Buffett told CNBC, the wealthy are definitely undertaxed relative to the general population. He further confirmed that his tax rate is lower than his secretary's. Whereas New York City billionaire Michael Bloomberg clarified, I'm a wealthy guy. I don't need a tax cut. And so we're going to have to put a little of that back. Another New York City billionaire, George Soros, stated, I am in favor of taxing the rich, including a wealth tax. Whereas New York City has 120 billionaires, the most billionaires in the country. Whereas Fresh Direct received more than $74 million in real estate tax abatements over 25 years. Whereas tax abatement programs reduce or eliminate the amount of property tax for mostly homeowners to pay on new construction, rehabilitation, and or major improvements, but it shouldn't eliminate property tax completely. Whereas New York City's Economic Development Agency has agreed to let Bronx-based e-commerce grocer Fresh Direct defer paying a $5.4 million tax bill for 5 years. Resolved that New York City billionaires are currently receiving unnecessary tax credits. Resolved that an overwhelming majority of foundational Black Americans in this country have been injured by enslavement and its legacy. Resolved that income taxes are a source of revenue for governments. They are used to fund public services, pay government obligations, and provide goods for citizens. Resolved that the New York City slaves were taxed as property, which is considered revenue for the government, and their descendants should be compensated. Further resolved that since most U.S. cities do not require an income tax, New York City should offer foundational Black Americans an exemption on their city income tax.